Hello, everyone. Hi. It's so wonderful to see everyone here. I'm sorry we don't have more seats. I think there are people watching from upstairs. If you're more comfortable up there, it's on the big screen. But it's so great to see so many friends and colleagues and here tonight. I feel like I'm at a reunion of some kind, but it's wonderful. But I want to start this off with in a very strange way. Someone found a Rolex watch in the third row. And I don't know whose it is, but Willow assures me that it's a fake. But if you think it's a lady's Rolex watch, please see me afterwards for the Kenneth Aller Smith Door Prize. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Fred Cook, and I'm the director of the USC Center for Public Relations here at the Annenberg School. And I want to welcome you to the 28th Annual Kenneth Aller Smith Symposium. And I hope you all are having a good time so far. Is that true? All right. I am. Like with anything that you do for a long time, and 28 years is a long time, sometimes you forget the real reason that it began in the first place. And this event was created to honor a USC professor named Kenneth Aller Smith. And he was the foundation of the public relations program at USC. And there's very few of us here today that ever met Kenneth. But Kirk Stewart, where is Kirk? Kirk is here. And Kirk was one of Kenneth Aller Smith's students. And tonight we're going to show you a film that Kirk produced to honor Kenneth Aller Smith and remind us what this event is all about. So if you could, please roll the film.
Dr. Smith represents to me what faculty at USC was at that time and I think is today. Those who are at the best of their game, those people who have actually worked in the field that they're teaching, and they're bringing with them that real-world knowledge and experience.
Doc Smith's background is very colorful. He became one of the very first public relations directors with Western Airlines when airlines were just saying, we have to look how to communicate.
After he left Western Airlines, that's when he really started to get serious about his educational career.
He was one of the very early public relations instructors in the country.
And then ended up at USC in 1970.
Maybe he saw that where his talents could best be used. He was a good teacher. He just understood. He understood people. He understood what they were looking for, but also, again, what they were capable of.
He was so excited about teaching and about students that you just felt you could do anything. And I think all of us who were Doc's kids, as we used to call ourselves, always used to comment how he believed in us so much that we just did amazing things. We didn't know we shouldn't or couldn't.
I think it was the fact that he took an interest in you, not just as a student, but as a person.
Dr. Smith had individual students, period. If he had a class of 30, he had 30 individual students that he knew and that he talked to.
When he walked into a classroom, you knew that he wanted to be there on that day or any day. You could hear a pin drop in his class because nobody wanted to miss anything he said. It was amazing.
And he said, I'm going to give you a toolbox that it doesn't matter where you go, whether you end up working for symphonies or airlines or animal rights, it doesn't matter. This toolbox is going to help you communicate what you're passionate about and make a difference.
In 1976, he founded the master's degree program in public relations, and then he started the first degreed program in sports information here at USC. It was the first one in the country.
Doc was one of the first academicians to actually have a key leadership role in the Public Relations Society of America.
He was the national president of PRSA in 1977.
And I think that was because they recognized that this was an extraordinary case of a practitioner who had become an academic, but that he was very valuable to the society.
He helped start the Public Relations Student Society of America.
He and I went to New York and we talked the professionals into giving us permission to start a society. Everyone said it can't happen, the students change all the time, they'll never have leadership. And within a couple of years, There were 9,000 students in chapters across the country, and it took off from there. And I was really lucky to be the first president of the PRSSA.
Shortly after he passed in 1988, several of us got together and said we should really find some way to repay him for the immense impact that he'd had on all of our lives. We thought one of the great ways to do that would be to start this symposium.
It's our way of really paying tribute to the people he made us be.
And whose sole purpose in life was to give you a foundation to grow.
Today, the purpose of this symposium is to provide a platform for leaders in the public relations field to come and share their insights and perspectives on the profession.
Challenge people to think and see the world in new ways, and to really, as he was, always be on the forefront in our field.
So he does. He stays alive in this way that, you know, we all have people in our lives who touched our lives deeply. And some are stamped a little deeper on your heart. And Doc is one of those people.
Tonight is the night that we unveil the 2018 Global Communications Report. This is a survey that we do every year of 1,000 PR professionals all around the world. And I want to thank our sponsors for this. First of all, Edelman for sponsoring the report, the Holmes Report for being our media partner every year in this effort, and Signal, the data analytics firm, for sponsoring this event tonight. So thanks very much to all of our sponsors. All of these other names are groups that have helped us conduct this survey. We work with really every public relations organization around the world to get the best information we can from all around the globe. And the purpose of the survey is designed to give everybody working in the profession and people who are thinking about joining it a glimpse into the future of what we think is one of the most dynamic professions on Earth. Tonight we'll explore the findings of the 2018 Global Communications Report, and we'll also hear some broad range of insights from our distinguished keynote speaker, Richard Edelman, who doesn't have a chair, and our distinguished panelists of experts and Paul Holmes in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to introduce someone who also, like Kenneth Smith, has an enormous impact on our students here at Annenberg, who has a deep understanding of the issues we face as an industry and makes a profound difference in the future of the Annenberg School. And that is my boss, Willow Bay.
Thank you, Richard. There's a seat. I vacated one for you. That's what happens, Fred, when you book a standing room only crowd. Fred, thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you on behalf of the Annenberg School to all of you for being here. Now, 28 years, as Fred noted, the Kenneth Smith Symposium is something that this community really looks forward to. And thank you, Kirk, for doing that phenomenal video. I'm sorry that I wasn't one of Doc's kids, because he clearly was an extraordinary man and one whose impact lives on through this event today. And Fred, a huge thank you to you and to your team at the PR Center, who have reimagined this event and its programming and made sure that it's squarely focused on the critical issues facing your industry, but also facing society more broadly. Also, I should thank everybody who's not just in the room, but who is joining us on Facebook Live. An important reminder of our ability to connect in all sorts of different ways than we could even have imagined just a few short years ago. So today's discussion about the evolution of ethics is firmly grounded in data collected from more than 1,000 PR professionals and students, which informed the 2018 Global Communications report that Fred is proud to debut this evening. And it's also reflected in the composition of our panel participants tonight, each of whom brings a very different perspective to the issue. It's also core to what I believe is a critical conversation about the global impact of technologies on our daily lives, both professional and personal, and on our society more broadly. You know, I don't have to tell you all about communications technology. We work with it, we live it each and every day. And it is changing, again, as you all know, at a speed and scope that is unprecedented. We've simply never lived through change this rapid before. I mean, just think about it, those things in our hands. Wireless communication has become the fastest diffusing communication technology in history, enabling, for example, social networks to connect billions of people in just a few short years, remaking entire industries and profoundly changing how we work, how we live, how we engage with the world around us, and how we engage with the people closest to us. In a few short years, this exciting industry has grown from a novelty to an instrument of overwhelming impact on the American people. That's a quote. That's a quote from a speech given in 1961 by Newton Minow, then FCC chair, in what became known as his famous vast wasteland speech to television executives. Right? He might as well been talking about today, about today's social media platforms, the exciting industry that's grown from a novelty to an instrument of overwhelming impact on the American people. Minow went on to tell the TV execs there, your industry possesses the most powerful voice in America. It has an inescapable duty to make that voice ring with intelligence and with leadership. That duty has long faced the media. It's the same duty now facing, confronting, really, the big tech companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter. It's most certainly a duty that is facing every single one of us in this room. The ethical concerns are daunting, and they are unfolding over a media landscape that's in turmoil. So our focus today on the evolution of ethics, the health of our public information systems, and our role as professional communicators couldn't be more important or more timely. This is the conversation we need to be having. Just think about what's happened in the past few months. The Cambridge Analytica privacy crisis at Facebook and the misuse of the data of 87 million users. The US Department of Justice indictments exposing just how critical Facebook and other platforms were to the spread of misinformation and disinformation to millions of Americans during the 2016 election and beyond. Recently, we had a fascinating talk with the former dean of Penn Annenberg, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who revealed her research, a book of it, on how Russian hackers and trolls weaponized our social networks and used them to attack our democracy. Facebook estimates, as you know, that as many as 150 million people saw content generated by the Russian conspiracy, and hundreds of thousands of Americans joined Russian-controlled Facebook groups. The ethical issues are gnarly there, and they are massive. And as we watch Mark Zuckerberg these past few days testify before Congress, Facebook and the other big tech platforms are facing a chorus of questions, not just from lawmakers, from consumers, from advertisers, from their own employees and investors, about their platform's vulnerability to propaganda, manipulation, and abuse, and whether they will help save a business near and dear to me, the news business, or destroy it, and along with it, American democracy. So, of course, it's not just the ethical duties of the tech platforms that deliver online information, not just the tech companies that are making news. Just last week, Sinclair Broadcasting Group, who does that very old school thing called TV, ordered its local anchors at nearly 200 statements to read a corporate message on air, what they call a must-run, denouncing the, and I'm quoting, troubling trend of irresponsible one-sided news stories plaguing our country. That was a must-run from Sinclair. I just want to share with you that the USC Annenberg School of Journalism, with the overwhelming support of its faculty, was among 13 journalism schools that immediately signed a letter of protest condemning this action. It's rare that I see faculty move that quickly. They moved quickly to get us that approval and that consensus. Of course, this rapidly changing media landscape and the increasingly complicated ethical considerations directly impacts the PR and communications industry, because these industries have been and always will be inextricably connected. No longer are there clear lines in the sand between earned and paid, and in fact, as Fred's data indicates, some audiences quite simply don't see those lines at all. As journalism attempts to engineer a sustainable new business model for the digital era, the PR and communications industries must do the same. And those new models must be designed to rebuild trust in media and the communications industry before we face what some are calling an information apocalypse. We need to be working together, professional communicators, journalists, publishers, platforms, technologists, scholars, teachers, and students. And let's not forget our role as consumers and citizens. This is the moment to be having conversations like this one, to be gathering as we are today, to examine the foundation for a new system of communications and a new system of media ethics that considers the role of technology and its real-world implications. Because we need a public information system that is accurate, that is ethical, that is free of bias, and not ones that are simply the consequence of narrow business models or driven by algorithms that prize engagement at all cost. This is too important. So this is a priority for us here at USC Annenberg, as I know it is for many of you, and just one of the reasons why I'm excited to be here today, to be sharing this evening with you. I too am looking forward to listening and learning and to keeping this extremely important conversation going well into our future that so depends on it. But first, we are going to hear from one of our foremost experts on trust, Richard Edelman, President and CEO of a certain leading global communications marketing firm that, oh, by the way, was named PR Agency of the Decade by both Advertising Age and the Holmes Report. Most of you know Richard extremely well. He is one of the legends in the business. You know his work in marketing and reputation management for major corporations, NGOs, and family businesses around the world. And in the past 2 decades, Richard, was that roughly? I can't imagine that it quite possibly, you've only been in this business a few short years, I can tell, has been a leading voice for trust in our key institutions, business, government, NGOs, and the media, traveling the world to discuss the latest findings of the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is now considered the global measurement of trust. So please join me in welcoming Richard Edelman to the stage.
Oh, there's a lot of water up here. That's good. So I come before you tonight standing on the shoulders of my dad, who would be deeply proud of me being here to talk about ethics. He did that many times, and some of you heard those speeches, and so I'll do my best here, Dad. See how you do. So it's a deep honor to be invited to this school to speak on this subject this evening. This mission of Annenberg to train young journalists and communicators obviously has never been more important. Because at the moment, we're in a battle for truth. We no longer share common facts. We no longer have a rational discourse. Decisions are being made on the basis of fears. They're also deeply emotional. And I'm afraid that at the moment, it's all about short-term personal benefit instead of long-term societal improvement. And at this moment, I would argue that silence is a tax on the truth. I want to quote a certain Hannah Arendt. For those of you students of the 1930s, you'll be familiar with this, but I want to quote her because I think that nations become vulnerable to populism and volatility when the media's role as the guardian of community values and the watchdog over the powerful is weakened. So in her study of the Third Reich, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she wrote, "The result of a constant and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lie will be accepted as truth and that truth is defamed as a lie, but actually it's the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world is now destroyed." Now think about that for those of you who've done anything from reading Animal Farm to any other. Because events in this last decade, but particularly in the last 18 months, have weakened trust in the core institutions of our society: business, government, media, and NGOs. There have been 5 waves of the trust tsunami. Let me try to identify those. They started in the early 90s, and it's really why we started the trust barometer after the battle in Seattle in the 90s, in late 1990s. The first wave was the onset of globalization, where people started to lose their jobs to China, India, etc. And it led to deindustrialization and compression of blue-collar workforce. The second was the Great Recession, Robert remembers well. 13 million Americans lost their homes. Countless others lost their dreams. The third wave, which is happening as we speak globally, is immigration. War, political instability have prompted mass migration, but the influx of immigrants has fueled fears about downward mobility rather than hopes for a better future. The fourth wave, which is subtle and continuing, is automation. That is responsible for 4 out of the 5 jobs lost. Not globalization, automation. Amazon promotes the store of the future. There are no people. That may be the future, but it's a big change from where we are today. And the last of these waves is the most insidious and damaging of them all: the age of disinformation. Because it undermines our ability to differentiate between truth and lie. Now, the media, unfortunately, is in a serious crisis of its business model. You know, having watched what's happened at the Denver Post in the last week, that the number of jobs in newsrooms has been reduced in some cases by as much as 66% in the last 10 years. The Denver Post is down to 80 people total in the newsroom, and I believe 1 person in the editorial department who wrote last week. Digital advertising is flatlined. Advertising in print is declining 15% a year. Those are the hard numbers. Things like native advertising and conferences are just small additions to the revenue line. Broadcast behemoths such as ESPN are losing viewers at the rate of 10% a year, hurt by cord cutting, switch to Netflix, etc. And the average age for the evening broadcast news is now 68 years old. Now, there is some good news in the Trump bump. That's fine. But that's ephemeral and not enough to offset the economics. But I'm not here to talk about media economics. There's much better courses you can take at this school. I am here to talk about the existential challenge in the loss of trust in our most traditional source of information, the media. The platform is burning. Specifically, here are some stunning statistics from the 2018 Trust Barometer. Media, for the first time in our 18 years doing the study, is now the least trusted institution in global governance. Consistently the least trusted, particularly so in the Western democracies. Even lower than government in those places. It's only high in markets such as China, where there's a certain identity of interest between government and media. Media is seen as elitist, biased, politicized, chasing clicks, ignoring average people, and for 29% of Americans, too depressing to read. As a result, 50% of those we survey globally and 55% of Americans told us we opt not to use mainstream media at all. So, are they uninformed? Perhaps. Are they differently informed? For sure. Now, to Willow's point on social media. The decline of trust in media this year is actually mostly attributable to the precipitous decline of trust in social media. So understand that there is now a 40-point gap between mainstream media and social media. 40 points in the US, UK, France, and Germany, which are the spear points for what Willow described as Russian incursion into the process of news creation. Finally, the consequence of this is deeply disturbing. 6 in 10 of those we talked to said, I can no longer distinguish between real news and fake news. Further, 60% say I can no longer judge the performance of an elected official. Therein lies the problem. How does democracy go on if, in fact, you can no longer trust the information to make decisions about your elected officials? In our business of public relations, we have relied upon the media to be our partner, to be the primary information channel and the source of truth. In a world of weakened media, I'm going to argue tonight that we now must recognize that we are, in fact, principals, not agents. We have to provide high-quality information direct to the end user. If the president can have 55 million followers on Twitter, you get the point. It's a responsibility that we should welcome. We have to accept the necessity of accuracy and accountability. We have to educate in order to get better decisions. Our aim should not be in any way to think of ourselves as supplanting mainstream journalism. It is, in fact, to be the support element for those who choose not to participate with mainstream journalism. Because the media is inherently the better source of objective fact gathering and dissemination. We are the supporting cast. I call on tonight every company to start to consider the big idea of becoming its own media company. We call this collaborative journalism at Edelman. You can call it what you like. But it's a news operation that speaks directly to the end user of that information. And it should do that through corporate channels as well as through social channels. I know Oscar's doing this already at Wells Fargo. He has 400 people doing this. But here's the key difference. We have to change the tone of our work. It has to no longer be advocacy and hype, which is giving you the extreme version. It has to actually be substantive, short form for sharing, and collaborative. And employees are the #1 target. But for this to succeed, we have got to have a highly established and publicly stated ethical standard. My dad said in a speech a decade ago, all of us in PR have to bring to the office every day the sense of morality and live by that every day. This is more true than ever before in the wake of Bell Pottinger and the scandal of South Africa. For those of you unaware of what happened, which I'm amazed if anybody is, but here you are, to establish fake Twitter identities to stir up racial tensions in South Africa is a foul crime against our business and against democracy. We can afford that no more. I'm proposing tonight 4 practical steps, which I think are actually Pretty straightforward in terms of an ethical standard for the business. I realize that the Council of PR firms and others have done very constructive work in this regard. For mine, these theoretically could be things that are globally accepted. First, water. Trump would insult me, but there we are. I have big hands. Just to say. Okay. That was a bad joke, young Gibbs. All right. Been waiting to use that for years. Okay. So the first is accuracy. We have got to have factually rigorous, journalistic level quality information to move from advocacy to education and to provide both sides of an issue. Straightforward. Second, transparency. Be accountable for what we promote, who we're working for, what we're doing here, why we're doing it. Visible, that's all, just why we're here. Third, an open exchange. As part of a company platform, a place for running commentary from consumers and employees. Be willing to surface the issues. That's all. Just leave them up there. Lastly, ethics training. Just have to do this. It has to be a universal about, this is how we do what we do. And it can't be just when there's a mistake. It just has to be basic. So maybe you thought I'd stop my speech there, but I'm not, because I'm on a roll. Look, there's a lot more to be done. And the reason for this is the epic decline of trust in government. Business is the last retaining wall for trust. And what's happened is that business is now expected to be the agile and inventive player. It's expected to fill the void. CEOs are now expected to speak up on issues because, guess what? The most trusted institution in global governance is actually my employer. My employer. It's not my government. It's not business. It's my employer. It's not even my family. It's my employer. Now, maybe that's because people work too much, but it's actually really profound. What's happened is, in this crazy time, people have even moved away from believing friends, family, and a person like yourself. They're withdrawing into their employer. Well, that's why your CEOs have to speak up. It's because, in a way, it's the one thing that people can control. They feel they can control their brand choice and the company that they work for. And if you want the best people, you have got to speak up on issues, particularly on issues that matter to your industry. Immigration for tech companies, supply chain on quality of food for McDonald's, like this. But let's just think about the challenges that are confronting business at the moment. Just immediate ones, just off the top of your head. Sustainability, unequal division of wealth, populism, tariffs, technological change. Here's the deal. All these call for a broader role for the corporation, but even more important, a broader responsibility for the Chief Communications Officer. Corey DeBrow, who was going to be here tonight but just took on a very small job at Google, suggested that there be a modification of the description of the CCO to Chief Conscience Officer. I think he's on the right path because, in fact, there should be a moral framework for business. Business has a deep ethical responsibility. That was actually envisaged more than 100 years ago by company founders, William Lever, William Henry Kellogg, others. But tonight, I'm going to suggest that this new job for the CCO is to establish the social contract for the corporation. That for Elliot Schrage, having come off of the hearings on Capitol Hill, he's got to go back and argue for a new operating framework for that company. Data portability, opt-out option, transparency on use of my data. And how about those who have the CCO job at FedEx or UPS? Within 10 years, all of their drivers will be in autonomous vehicles, more or less. Well, there are 3 million truck drivers in the United States. 3 million. They have the highest paid blue-collar jobs. You want to see upset? Watch what's going to happen if there's not retraining of these people. And whose job is it to argue for that retraining? It is the CCO. Because the CCO should be the advocate for change at the corporation. What's happening at advanced companies, whether it's Sue Gerhardt at Nissan or David Kamenetsky at AB InBev, or Andy Farrow at Mars, or Jonathan Adashek at Nissan, they have responsibility not just for communications. They're involved in the issues of supply chain and sustainability, how business is being done. So, in fact, I want the new descriptor, Paul got that descriptor, not change the title, descriptor of the CCO to be the Chief Change Officer. Because you should, all of you, be pushing your companies to change how they do business. Not wait, as Facebook did, until an existential crisis. But do it before and force the corporation to be an advocate for better. Because that's what's necessary to get trust back in this society. But I'm not leaving it with the corporations. Melissa, I'm here to also recommend a significant evolution of the communications firm. So, of the top 10 PR firms in the last year, only 2 of them grew. 8 of them shrank or were flat. That's charitably called weak growth. Why? Well, cutbacks in CPG spending, insourcing to cut costs, squeeze on corporate communications budgets. I've heard it all because, you know, I'm experienced it. But here's the deal. If our remit is media relations, the cutbacks are justified. And the reaction by 2 of the major holding companies to combine PR operations under advertising is hardly a stirring endorsement of the future prospects of our sector. So I also call tonight for the real job of the communications firm to be to bring change to business, to bring ideas that in fact do change business. And we should be the ones who bring this creative spark that starts movements, to bring purpose to brands and to solve big problems in society. So what I would tell you is, at Edelman, we're trying to do that. We've hired 600 people who are creatives, planners, and paid people. We have an 800-person social digital operation. And our idea is earned at the core, social by design. Okay, but we've had to recast our work as communications marketing in order to get permission to talk to CMOs as well as CCOs, because that's the future of the business. Solve the client's problem. Don't just obey lines of command. And I would just say that our frequent crisis work for United, our brand marketing work for Dove, helping CVS get out of the cigarette business and save lives, and the idea for REI of closing its stores the day after Thanksgiving on Black Friday, and a resulting huge increase in store traffic in the wake, are indicative of that kind of thinking. And we're competing directly not just with our classic WagEd and other, but also with ad agencies, digital firms, and media buyers. Because in the end, clients should have multiple options to get to solution. So to bring this magnum opus to an end, mercifully for all of you, the fact is we are at a time of deep discontent. It's a very strange moment because, in fact, the global economy is pretty good. But the pace of change has caused fears to overwhelm the hope for the future. Think about it. I'm afraid of the pace of innovation. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my social status. My neighborhood is changed by immigrants. I have an unfamiliar cultural context. And all of this plays into this kind of inchoate demand for change. And a sort of desire for immediate gratification. You know, give me my fix. Give me my opioid. Given that business is now, in fact, the most trusted institution in the world, it does have the best position to move society forward. But to earn that mandate, business has to act in a different way. And the only way that's going to happen is if the Chief Communications Officer becomes the Chief Change Officer, and if those of us in the agency business force that change with great ideas. Because from counsel and conscious to actor and creative, from what we say to what we do, in fact, those of us in communications are the invaluable bridge to the future for our business. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was really awesome. I think that we can all go home now. No, we can't. There's a lot more. And thank you, Willow, also for your role, and that was really good. I want to talk to you just a few seconds before I introduce the panel about the Global Communications Report. I'm going to give you some quick highlights about some of the information before we talk a little bit more about ethics. And I want to share two little known facts. One is, 30-something years ago, I used to work for Edelman in the LA office, and currently my wife does. Every year we do this survey, and it elicits some really interesting insights, and this year was no different. And when Richard was talking about change, that was the first thing we asked people, do you think that the PR industry is going to change over the next 5 years? And the answer was, definitely it's going to change either considerably or drastically. What's going to cause those changes? Innovation. Innovation in media, innovation in technology, innovation with data, and innovation in business models. These are going to be the key drivers to all that change, and it's pretty damn exciting stuff, if you ask me. When we ask, are you prepared for this change? The answer was a little different. Agencies, only 18% of agency representatives said they were very prepared for the change coming in the future. And for corporate in-house teams, only 8% said they were very prepared. So there's a lot of change on the way, but we're not really ready for all of that change quite yet. What do those changes look like? Two huge changes. One is really positive, that 83% think that the public relations function is going to become a lot more important over the course of the next 5 years. And 87%, which is a jump of about 35% since last year, think that the PR industry is going to be more aligned with marketing. And the good news behind all of this is it's going to be good for growth, but it's also going to be good for revenue increases. 86% of agencies think their revenue will increase in the coming year. That's a slight drop from last year, but it's a very optimistic picture. And we asked them how much. Believe it or not, 50% thought that number would increase by more than 15%, which, as Richard said, is probably not the big agencies, but it's still a very optimistic picture. When we asked corporate people, 50% said that they would be increasing their budgets in this coming year. And that group said by about 14%. So we're looking at a very robust industry despite all the change and all the challenges. And that's really good for the people entering the industry, the students, because most people are going to be hiring. 71% of agency representatives and 48% of in-house said that they will be hiring in the coming year at a rate of around 15%. So that's all very good news. The media is also in a state of change. We see, again, we've asked this question 3 years in a row. We're seeing, as Richard said, a giant shift away from earned media to paid, owned, and shared. If you look on the far right, you'll see that in 5 years, earned media will be equally as important as owned media in the corporate world. So that's a big shift in the way that we're working and the way that we're telling our stories. And probably the most profound, and it really reinforces what Richard said, we asked PR people, in the next 5 years, will the average consumer know the difference between paid and earned content? Will they know the difference between a news story written by a reporter and promotional content developed and paid for by a company? And 64% of PR professionals said the answer to that question is no. We also asked them if they would care about the difference between these two, and 59% predicted that the average consumer would not even care. And I believe this presents, as Richard was saying, a significant ethical issue, which is a nice transition into our panel to talk about the evolution of ethics. So let me introduce the people that are going to be speaking in the next few minutes. And I'm really excited about who we've got here. First of all, and you can come up when I introduce you, Robert Gibbs, the Global Chief Communications Officer and Executive Vice President of Corporate Relations at McDonald's. Robert, as many of you know, was also press secretary for the first 2 years of the Obama administration and a valued advisor to the president. Yay. Secondly, Melissa Waggener-Zorkin. Melissa is the CEO and founder of Waggener Edstrom, which is now We Communications. She built the agency from a 2-person firm to one of the largest independent companies with over 800 employees. She is well known for her belief in purpose and potential, and she frequently gives back through community and philanthropic efforts. Thank you, Melissa. Our next panelist is Sofia Noble, Dr. Sofia Noble, excuse me. Her book. It is called The Algorithms of Oppression. It has just been released, and she told me tonight it's selling like hotcakes, right, Sofia? Sofia is a professor at Annenberg. She conducts research focused on the design of digital media platforms on the internet and their impact on society. Her recently published book discusses racist and sexist algorithmic biases in commercial search engines. She also has a background in advertising and marketing. So thank you very much, Sofia. And finally, Oscar Suris, the Executive Vice President of Corporate Communications at Wells Fargo. And I think Oscar is going to have some interesting stories to share with us tonight. He was previously worked at Ford Motor Company and 11 years of journalism experience, including 5 years at the Wall Street Journal. Thanks, Oscar. And finally, Paul Holmes, my friend and the chair of the Holmes Group and the founder of the Holmes Report. He's been writing about public relations for over 25 years and is also the member of the ICCO Hall of Fame, and he will moderate our panel discussion. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. It's actually up to 30 years, and Richard is claiming it's 35, but I'm not wholly convinced of that. But I have been doing this a long time, and one of the great pleasures, actually, of having hung around for so long is that I now seem to be invited to this event every year. It is one of the most fun things that I do. It's always a lively, intellectually stimulating environment. The student body here in particular is just remarkably engaged and remarkably articulate and remarkably willing to sort of challenge the conventional wisdom of our industry. So I love coming out here. And I'm blessed with a terrific and diverse panel that I'm sure is going to have an interesting perspective on some of the slides that we're going to look at in a moment. So interestingly enough, we're going to start with this, and I'm not sure whether I think that 46% of PR professionals who believe that business has become more ethical in the last 5 years is a glass half empty or a glass half full scenario. But I did want to maybe provide some context for that. So some of you will know that every year the Holmes Report produces a list of the top 10 business crises of the previous year. I would argue that in recent years at least, each of those crises has represented to one extent or another an ethical lapse, because actually I think that unless an ethical lapse causes the crisis, or unless an ethical lapse goes on to exacerbate the crisis via a cover-up or some other inappropriate response, you actually don't have a crisis at all. I think that these days ethics violations and crises are more or less synonymous in our business. And so I went back to 2013, 5 years ago, and looked at what we were covering, and we were covering GlaxoSmithKline embroiled in a bribery scandal in China. We were covering AT&T involved in giving away its data to government snoops so that they could figure out what ordinary citizens were up to. We were looking at Walmart launching a food drive for its own employees. And this was before your time, so we won't hold you personally responsible. McDonald's using its website to advise its employees, who clearly were not paid enough to survive without a series of life hacks, how they could use life hacks to get by on the meager salary that the company was paying them. 2014, Facebook, odd, was conducting psychological experiments on its users without telling them. Sony was being hacked and there was a massive data breach, and GM was recalling a record number of vehicles. 2015, it was Volkswagen's turn to recall a massive number of vehicles because they'd been systematically cheating emissions tests, and Theranos was in the headlines. 2016, as a follow-up to Theranos, we had the Mylan EpiPen example where we arbitrarily decided to just raise the price of life-saving medication because what were people going to do other than pay that price? We had another data breach. Sorry if this gets repetitive. And we had Samsung's phones exploding on airplanes. Last year, we expanded our list of global crises from 10 to 15 for the first time. Apple was found to be deliberately slowing its telephones. Wells Fargo had a problem or two. Uber's entire corporate culture was creating a crisis a week, whether it was sexual harassment or overpricing or all kinds of wonderful activities there. United Airlines was telling girls in slacks that they couldn't board its plane and dragging doctors down the aisle with scant regard for their personal safety. It hadn't yet gotten around to killing pets by putting them in overhead bins, but we'll get to that next year. Samsung was being accused of bribery, and Pepsi was producing advertising that scandalized at least half of the population in the United States by being grossly insensitive. So I guess my question based on that is, what evidence do we have that business is becoming more ethical? And I guess I'd like to start with Dr. Noble, just because she doesn't necessarily have a horse in this race, right? But as an observer of and veteran of this industry, what evidence do you see that business is becoming better behaved?
It's a great question. Thank you for giving me the mic first, because it's only going straight to hell from here. All right, so let me give you...
That's why they asked me to do this.
Yeah, well, you did it very well.
I know the way.
Yeah, I saw a lot of shoulders tight up there in the audience. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really important is that we nuance this conversation with who the ethical crises, who's in the target of the ethical crises. And I think one of the things that we're always thinking is the company, the CEO, the leadership, the management team. Those are the people facing the crisis. But I think, Richard Edelman's talk tonight, for me, really foregrounded that the crisis is for the people who are most vulnerable, the people who are exploited by the lack of solid ethical decision-making. So let me give you a few facts, because I'm a professor and I like facts, and I think those will also help us frame our conversation tonight. So the UK House of Commons just a couple of days ago issued a report, a study that by 2030, the top 1% of the world will own 2/3 of the world's wealth. The top 1% will own 2/3 by 2030. According to the American Association of University Women, the gender pay gap will not close until 2119. 101 years from now, ladies, that's when we're going to feel good about getting paid the same thing as men. African Americans coming out of the period of enslavement owned 0.05% of American wealth. 0.05, 0.5%, coming out of the period of enslavement. That number has not budged in 150 years. Very, very infinitesimal. In fact, the latest studies from several places indicate that it will take 228 years to close the racial wealth gap in the United States. Now, these are the kinds of things that I think when we talk about the ethical crisis that you talked about, Richard, which is wages going down, benefits going down, people not being able to survive, the crisis that inflames people when they do not have a good quality of life. If business is the last kind of frontier to protect the public, then I think we've got to think about what the role of companies will be in supporting communities, particularly those who are most vulnerable. What we see in many ways is that I think globally, people's lives have become so unstable. And these are about the economic, political, and social factors that are affecting their lives. And so these, to me, are the kinds of things that we've got to talk about when we talk about ethics. It's not just about kind of the business decisions that we make, but the human beings that are part of the companies with which companies are doing business, employing, sourcing materials, and otherwise. I'll just say that one other thing. My work is really concerned with the lack of human beings that are involved in automated decision making. I study search engines, I study technology platforms, I study artificial intelligence, robotics, and what we see is that we have more and more reliance upon automated decision making systems rather than human decision making systems. How humans have not even sorted out how to nuance and resolve these kinds of issues that are facing us. In fact, they're getting worse. So how would we have technical systems that only stand to kind of flatten these conversations, stand as a proxy for human beings? And I think this room of people, you are so incredibly important in these conversations about nuancing the future. And let's not cede all that territory to technological solutions.
Okay, so I have this whole, thank you. I have this whole PowerPoint presentation with lots of slides that I'm supposed to get through and probably won't, because one of the things that happens here is that this discussion becomes really organic. So I want to pick up on Richard's notion of sort of what our profession is, chief change, chief conscience officer, whatever, and suggest another alternative to that based on what you just said, which is maybe the most important job for public relations going forwards in this environment, is to be the chief empathy officer, is to be the person inside the organization whose responsibility is to listen to those people who are affected by those crises and to bring their voice into the organization. And so I guess the question for the practitioners here is, to what extent are we as an industry, a profession, ready for that job? And to what extent do the organizations that we work for want somebody to do that? Or are they horrified at the prospect?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the research that Richard and his group have done for years, the good news, Paul, is you will always have a top 15.
Oh,
right?
Excuse me, I'm not losing sleep over that.
When we get to pay equity in 2119, someone will still have the top 15 PR crisis or company crisis. That they'll always exist. I do think. I think there's reason to be somewhat optimistic, because I think if you look at the Larry Fink letter from BlackRock, expecting companies to do more and to put some financial muscle behind that expectation, right? So that CSR isn't this room down the hall that you go to and visit if you need to say something good because you've done something bad. I had an interesting interaction. I was in Seattle a few weeks ago, and you know, Seattle's is a deeply progressive place. And we had just made an announcement that week at McDonald's that we were entering into verifiable climate change targets to reduce greenhouse gases over the course of the next 12 years, basically in accordance with what the Paris Climate Agreement would have instituted on us as a business, were it's still the regime of the land, if you will. And I was struck. So I did a roundtable with maybe 15 stakeholders, environmental groups, things like that, and we talked about this. And I was really struck by something. I started talking about why this was the right thing to do, and to a person in that room, they all said, when you go out and describe what you're doing and why you're doing it for McDonald's, do us a favor. Tell everybody it's good for business. Don't tell everybody it's the right thing to do. Tell everybody that you looked at it and it makes sense because that's what your responsibility is. But you know what? You're in business to make money, and this will help. Because when we build trust, you can look at any reputation study for any company in the world and ask them if you would visit your propensity to purchase and whether you trust the company, and your propensity to purchase that item if you do trust the company. There's a big difference. The delta of purchase intent plus trust, I can assure you, is far greater than the cost of business lost because of doing the right thing if you somehow feel like it has to be managed quarterly for Wall Street. So I think there's reason to be optimistic. Again, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised that this room full of environmentalists said, please don't describe this as the right thing to do. Describe it as best for your business. It's not hugely counterintuitive, but the passion with which they said it led me to really understand and believe more so that business has this permission. It just has to act on it. Right? What I'd love for you, you know, and maybe you have this, and if you do, I apologize. Run in sequence or with that top 15, the top 15 companies that either were the most improved or that did the right thing at a point in which you didn't expect them to, or it was maybe counterintuitive to what you might have believed. My guess is we'd be happy at some of what's on that list, just as we shake our head every year at the top 15. I mean, you look at Facebook, I mean, you could say 1,000 things about this. The thing that you just have to keep coming back to is you've known about it for 2 years. I mean, right. It's okay for some of us to be surprised, but not all of us can be surprised.
Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a great time for us to be us. And to your point, I'm also an eternal optimist. And to the point, Richard, that you made about what we can do and the power we have within organizations if we'll only have the courage to step up and to tell truth to some of those people that won't like it. And we will have consequences. We will. We might lose our best people. We might lose revenue for, oh no, you know, we might lose our friends even. But what's more important than having the chance to actually walk into someone and say, if we're really going to do this, to your point, and do it right, and not have it be an afterthought, not have it be a trend, but rather intrinsic decision-making at the core different now, then we have to be willing to have that courage and to tell that truth. And so I think the first thing we need to, as communicators, recognize is that a lot of the CEOs you're working with are waiting for that. They don't get it from anybody else. And so having had the opportunity and the privilege to really speak to many of them, they're waiting to understand what to do next. And what I found they want to hear most first is start at the start with purpose. Why do we do what we do? What are we in it for anyway, to your point? And go into the company and understand what the employees want and reflect that back, because that's where you're going to be the most successful, is having a reflection of all the people who come to work for you every single day, and get connected with that first. So that's the first step, and you can start right there, telling the CEO that.
So Oscar, you've been in the cauldron, right, more recently than anyone else at the table.
Yes.
And I'm curious, sort of, what do you think it is that leads companies, senior executives, to lose sight of that purpose and be distracted by quarterly profits is probably wrong, right? But sufficiently distracted that things go horribly wrong. And to what extent have you seen the company recover its sort of true north in the last year or so?
I guess there's that old saying, you're probably never as good as your press clips say, and you're probably never as bad as your press clips might reflect. And I've certainly experienced that. I think success can be dangerous. I mean, one of the reasons why our story was such a big story is on September the 7th, 2016, we were one of the most admired banks in our industry. One of the most admired brands. We were on Fortune's most admired list. I have the issue back at the office, but on September the 8th, 2016, we made a series of announcements that really called a lot of that into question for our stakeholders, because there were some ethical lapses by people, and though we had felt that over the years we had been addressing some of those issues by holding our people accountable, and in many cases terminating thousands of people over the course of 5 years, as a report would conclude exactly a year ago, released by our board of directors, we didn't go nearly as far as we should have done. We weren't aggressive enough in tackling the problem at its root cause, and we were operating in a very decentralized fashion, and had confidence in the inherent goodness of the vast majority of our people, that we missed a bigger problem that was forming. And so I think sometimes success can blind us. Also, sometimes I think insular thinking. Because when you spoke about us being providing empathy through our roles, I think of it a lot as being that representative inside the company that is bringing the outside in, the outside voices, the outside perspective of stakeholders, and which is why I think one of the fundamental things that we do is help entities and organizations and companies be aware of the perception gaps that can exist at any moment. And there was a significant one when we entered into our agreements in September of 2016. We had thought, that we had worked well with our regulators. We had plenty of data and points to make about really sincere efforts our people had made over the years to tackle this problem. But there was clearly a gap between how we perceived the situation and how America saw it. And so therein lied the problem and the challenge, and we're working our way through it to this day, and have made a lot of progress through transparency, through a lot of change inside the company that is difficult to see externally, but is nonetheless has occurred, through executive accountability, which is of tremendous importance right now for any organization facing something like what we faced, and through genuine reforms and recommitments to the core values that we held going into this situation, but that we absolutely needed to reinforce coming out of it.
Cool. So I'm going to go back to the presentation for a second and present you with this slide, because people are certainly more optimistic about the next 5 years than their mixed opinion on the last 5 years. Over the next 5 years, most people believe, and actually an overwhelming 62%, if my math is correct, believe that they will become, that business in their countries will become somewhat more ethical or a lot more ethical. Even leaving aside the PR person's natural Pollyanna-ish tendency, I hope that's an encouraging result. And I think some of it, perhaps, is sparked by what's gone on in the world in the last year or so, where, and you know, this I think is related to Richard's point about business being now the most trusted institution in a lot of societies around the world, where we've seen business begin to take a leadership position on a host of issues where government is perceived as falling short, whether it's, you know, to your point, the environmental protocols, whether it's immigration, whether it's being prepared to pull their business out of states where discrimination against the LGBTQ community is particularly egregious. And I think one of the things that we're seeing at play here, not sure if you'd agree, is that business, and this is where part of where the pragmatism comes in, business needs a stable world in which to thrive. And the chaos and uncertainty that we've seen in the political realm has to be counterbalanced by something. And we have seen the reemergence of sort of business leaders as statesmen, as people who are prepared to speak out on these issues. What do you think is driving that? And what do you think separates those companies that are prepared to take a leadership position from those who continue to sit on the sidelines? Robert?
Well, I mean, some of it is, as you said, is a bit of the external environment, right? As something becomes less, something has to become more. Now, the irony is, think back, you don't have to go far back in your memory. In 2008 and 2009, business trust was not exactly at its zenith. And so it does show you that there's an interesting cycle to this that I think is tremendously important. But I think it also underscores, and again, this is when Richard does this research, it lays bare a lot of interesting facts. But I mean, I think the desire for this to become more ethical isn't simply because somebody's perceived to have left the playing field. I think it's just, in some ways, the building of trust and that foundation that is imperative for any institution isn't something that you would like to have. It's something you have to have. It is table stakes. It's your ante to get in the game. And so, again, I think in some ways, business coming back again shows you where it had come in 10 years to now be in a place that's more revered. I worked, when I was in the White House, I remember our chief of staff at the time, Rahm Emanuel, said a quote that he got some grief for, but it's true: never let a good crisis go to waste. And if you think about that, if you're facing a trust deficit, then there's no better time than the present to use that crisis to be the conscience change or empathy officer that has to happen. And I think that's imperative. You see this now. I mean, I saw today, was it 1 in 9? I think it was 9%, so 1 in 11 had deleted their Facebook page, according to a study in the last, census thing. Now, 9% doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a pretty big chunk, right? I mean, if 100 million people are on it in the United States, that's a pretty big. So again, I don't think it's something that's nice to have anymore. I think it's something that you have to have for people not to vote with their feet or with their wallet to go somewhere else.
Safiya, how optimistic are you on this?
Not optimistic. Listen, this is difficult for me because I think the register in which we're having this conversation is about individual players, individual actors being good people, and I just don't think that's my experience of how business works. So I want to get us in a different register, which is what we have and what we're seeing as, with all due respect, we have a banking and financial services market that prior to the recession was betting against Americans through financial gamification tools, algorithmic software gamification tools, betting on the failure of Americans. And the result of that being an completely opaque decision-making system that was run through these kind of gamified software programs that removed agency from individual players and their good intent. And what we saw, in fact, was the largest wipeout of wealth of African Americans, for example, in the history of the United States. Now, this is like my grandparents' generation. Everything that a whole 2-3 generations of people work to acquire in terms of access to the American dream wiped out through gamified systems. So I think it's important for us to really raise our level of analysis about how we are going to have impact on these kinds of decisions that get meted out by corporations that are far larger than even the board of directors or the senior executive team in trying to wade their way through multinational types of concerns. So I think this is one of the things that we talked. You mentioned the kind of the people and how they're informed. And one of the things that I can say as a professor teaching students, both undergraduate and graduate, is that there is so little understanding of the complexity through which automation and automated systems thinking and our fetishizing of that, quite frankly. There's such a drive for AI and these kinds of new, we use words like innovation and creative and gig and fancy words that mask in many ways the loss of agency for people to make good decisions, ethical decisions. And in fact, many of these systems have some of the worst ethical frameworks baked into them. So I'm less optimistic because I think we are ceding too much decision-making power into systems thinking that doesn't really allow for us to have the kind of impulse and impact. And we certainly, I'll tell you, we're hiring armies of computer scientists and computer engineers coming out of schools, universities all over the country who have tested out of all of their humanities. They've AP tested out of all their humanities and social science courses. They've not taken a single course that can help them nuance their understanding of society. In fact, I often say to engineers, you want to design technologies for society, but you don't know anything about society and you have no training whatsoever. And so how can we talk about this register that we're in about good people doing good things when your IT departments and your logistics and kind of real-time, just-in-time management systems have removed much of the kind of influence and agency that we might have. And so these are the things I feel like if we're going to be chief empathy officers, we need to get a more critical, I'd like to have chief critical thinking officers maybe at the table, because I think that's incredibly important. And there's just a low level of literacy there in those spaces.
So I feel like I should give Oscar the right to respond to that if he wants to, and then I'm going to move the conversation along.
Well, I think one of the reasons why when the financial crisis occurred and we were in a position to acquire a bank that was on the precipice of failure, Wachovia, was because we were into old-fashioned lending. And we also saw some of the craziness that was in the market, particularly in the real estate market, and we dialed back a lot of our activity and ceded leadership in the marketplace because if it didn't make sense for our customers, it wasn't making sense for us. Now, that said, in the wake of the crisis, shortly thereafter came the foreclosure crisis. We had a huge obligation to be engaged and doing our part to, help as many Americans as possible avoid one of the worst events that could possibly happen in your life is to lose your home. So literally had to create a mortgage modification business out of nothing. And we had home preservation, what we called home preservation workshops across the country, and we rented out arenas and invited consumers to see us in private settings to talk about how they could avoid losing their homes, and we tried to work with them as best as possible in compassionate ways so they could avoid that sort of tragedy. And we forgave billions in principal and modified mortgages and extended payments, and have since also developed a program to invest in a lot of communities that were disproportionately impacted by giving down payment assistance to a lot of home buyers who are right on the cusp of being either first-time home buyers or re-entering the home market, but if not for that down payment, they would be there otherwise. So I actually have optimism because I have optimism in humanity, and I saw it myself in the wake of that foreclosure crisis. We saw people confronted with a tidal wave coming at us, and they got creative. They said there's a way to confront this, and they really cared about doing it in the most humane way possible. And it's when people rise in moments like that, it's inspiring. And so I still retain faith that even with all these dangers you're describing, and they're very real, and I don't mean to minimize them, I do believe in us, and I think that the best of us will shine through.
Okay, I'm going to move the conversation along because the next, sorry, something weird is happening with my presentation here. So, there we go. So there's also broad optimism here about the fact that the public relations industry will become more ethical, particularly internationally, but also in the US. And that, I think, plays into the issue of public relations person as chief conscience officer. This idea of public relations as the conscience of the corporation is certainly not a new one. I was sort of brought up with that idea. I've always been a little hesitant to endorse it because I think that in many cases, the only thing a conscience does is nag, and if you become the institutional nag within an organization, you'll be shut out of a lot of meetings that you should be a part of. But certainly, I've always believed that there's also a confluence between public relations and ethics. If you think about what is the best way for me to build a positive relationship with somebody, and if you think about what is the ethical thing to do, I would argue that 99 times out of 100, you'll come to exactly the same place, that public relations and ethics are inextricably aligned, or good public relations and ethics are inextricably aligned. Having said that, I do wonder whether we've failed to make that case inside organizations, whether given the continuous proliferation of ethical crises in business and ethical lapses in business, we are somehow failing our clients or our bosses in that regard. Melissa?
Well, I don't really know if we're failing as much as the scrutiny and the swirl around us is greater, and we're just now paying a lot more attention to it. But I know many times when I failed, so absolutely, I'll take that. But I think that a good public relations person has the ear of all the executives in the company, plays the role of walking in and saying, if you do this, that's not true to this company, this is what will happen, and continues to repeat that again and again. I also think, going back to the technology thing for a minute, the genie is out of the bottle. Technology is technology. It is out. And so I would also say, as a communicator, then we have the chance to say, here's what's going to happen as a result if you don't utilize technology the right way. If you don't, Mr. Zuckerberg, or whoever we might be advising, go out and do something different. Now's the time to change. So I think, you know, I agree with you that it's too bad and that these things are piling up, but at the same time it is there, so we need to figure out as PR people what to do about it. And the final thing I'd say about AI is that I know that there are people, because I sit at dinner parties all the time, and many of them, and they're people who are in technology, and many of them will say, it's the best thing that's going to happen to us in the next 10 years. And some of them will say it's the worst thing. And when you listen to the arguments and you go back and forth, you know, you start to draw your own conclusion. Mine is that big data, which affords us a lot of this automation, a lot of this, you know, decision making that's not ours, should give us the platform really to think about small data. Because I don't think you can actually replace, as you said, the human and the person that takes that big data and turns it into the right thing for the CEO or whoever they're advising, the president in your case.
Let's dwell on this for a second, because, you know, I think it's pertinent to some of the things that we're reading about in the news today. So you have a situation, I think, right now at Facebook, where Facebook is being quite open about the fact that their technology got ahead of their human thinking. That the technology, they kept moving forward because that's what you do if you're a giant shark and you want to survive, without necessarily thinking through all of the implications of that forward momentum. And suddenly finding yourself in a position where, you know, even if we take him at his word, the best interpretation is that Mark Zuckerberg found himself horrified to realize that what he'd created had a role in destroying democracy. How do we then, you know, Melissa and Oscar and, you know, everybody really, how do we then make sure that there is a voice inside the organization that puts the brakes on some of those decisions? Is that even a realistic thing to expect an organization to do, if you buy my shark analogy? And are we as public relations people powerful enough and respected enough and wise enough and courageous enough to be the ones who play that role? Or if it's not us, who?
Well, I think, just briefly, a lot of the CCOs that I work with do play that role. Some of them, as a result, might be moving around a little bit more than they have in the past. And I think that the point you're saying, they need to be on the design front. They need to be in the intrinsic decision-making process up front. Absolutely. So they need to report to the CEO. That's another thing that we all need to understand, is that they need to have that voice directly to the CEO.
Let's also understand that none of the crises that you mentioned, none of those were PR crises. That's how we think about them. That's how we talk about them. No, I'm not saying you.
I don't actually believe in the idea of a PR crisis. It's either a crisis or it isn't. Right?
But what I'm suggesting is somehow it is a crisis that can or is rooted in and can be solved in communications. Volkswagen didn't get in trouble because the communications department didn't test the vehicles the right way, right? So the empathy change conscience officer has to go. Let
me stop you for a second and not necessarily challenge that, but add another dimension to it.
Okay.
But I can, because I know some of the people who were at Volkswagen pre and post, and because this comes back to my initial question to Melissa, right? So what happened at Volkswagen was that got done as an executive. There was an executive decision there, and you alluded to this too with Facebook, and they'd known for 2 years. There was an executive decision made to not include anybody from the PR department in the discussion about what the actual policy should be, or whether something should be covered up or not covered up. And that goes to my point, are we powerful enough? Are we respected enough? Are we taken seriously enough to be part of those discussions? I mean, I'm sure that nobody came to Oscar at Wells Fargo and said, you know, we're committing this massive fraud. Do you think that's a good idea or not? But you know, to a certain extent,
they did not do that. But
how do you?
I would tell you, I think we need to be a bit careful about over-assigning. I mean, look, I got a sign in my office. It's anybody here a Spider-Man fan? Okay. And you know the quote, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And I hung that up in my office when I took this role. But I think one of my responsibilities, which I take seriously, is being an evangelist for having others also sweat and think about reputation as much as I do. That it's not just the corp comms functions role, but it's actually, you know, everyone's role at the company. To own reputation, to own ethics, to own the values of the company, and to also think through the unintended consequences of business actions. And some unintended consequences pose minimal risk, right? Some more than we can imagine, right? And because I think a lot of times this is where insidious things fester and become big problems is the well-intended plan or strategy. In our case, it was a compensation program. But the undercalled unintended consequences that come with them, right. And you know, you need more than just the PR department alert to that. You need the HR functions, and the compliance functions, and the risk functions, and the executives themselves.
Right. So I interrupted you, Robin. So I'll come back to you in a second. So, but that's an interesting question, right? So clearly, the way you set your compensation policy has the potential to impact your reputation. Therefore, I would argue that no compensation policy should be put in place without public relations people who are responsible for reputation having input into it. How many organizations, how many people in this room have ever been asked whether they think their organization's compensation policy is a good idea? Okay, that's actually way more impressive than I expected. Because, you know, you can look at, I mean, if you look at what happened to BP, 7 or 8 years ago, right? That was a compensation, that was a compensation policy issue. They were being compensated on production and growth and not on environmental health and safety. Yet, PR people are in infinitesimal numbers involved. Sorry, Robert, go back to your original point.
My only point was similar to Oscar. I mean, I think we definitely do have to be the first rung in that ladder, but understand that if it's just us or us alone, if it's us against the world or us against the rest of the company, I mean, in reality, all of those crises that you talked about, somebody somewhere determined that they might be able to get away with that. Right? So consequently, somebody could have said, well, you might get bad PR on this. Well, we did a little cost benefit in our head, and we decided we can sustain a little bad PR. Now, they snowball. But so I think we have to be, I think we absolutely have to be that conscience. I think we have to be a convener. We have to be somebody that has the ability to spread and have that discussion throughout the company, to have that seat at the table. You know, I mean, PR, media relations, communication, whatever you want to call it. If we're at the end of the pipe where the water spits out and you can't do anything about what goes into the pipe, then it's never going to happen.
Right.
But I think more and more people having seats at the table. I mean, we can have this debate about who, you know, I would not take a job as a chief communications officer if I didn't report to the CEO.
Okay, I'm going to blow through a couple of these slides fairly quickly. More optimism. Everybody thinks that business is going to become more ethical. Oh, that's because I'm going backwards. Right. Up and down arrows are very confusing. Everybody thinks we should have a code of ethics, but not everybody thinks that it should be rigorously enforced. I don't know what you guys make of that, but it seems to me to be a little bit alarming. I don't particularly want to dive into the code of ethics issue because we've got fairly limited time. I actually wanted to go through this a little bit. The distribution of fake news is the biggest problem, given that my whole presentation last year was about that topic. I obviously find that encouraging. Purposeful distortion of truth, defense of malicious behavior. Bear those two things in mind. A lack of corporate transparency. Bear those two things in mind, three things in mind for a second, while I slip on to this last slide, which is, to what extent does representing working for the following industries represent potential ethical issues? Lots of people think that there are ethical issues involved in working for firearms, tobacco, and Robert political candidates. Religious organizations, nuclear power, marijuana, really? And so forth. And then just to go, oh, I thought there was a second slide with some of the other industries on it there. But no, because the banking industry and the fast food industry both show 40% of people being slightly, students in particular, slightly worried about representing those industries. However, I wanted to make a different point from this slide, because I actually think that you can do ethical PR for all of these institutions, and you can also do unethical PR for NGOs and charities and environmental groups, and I've actually seen that with my own eyes. What I think this says, though, is that we have to move towards a post-advocacy definition of what public relations is about. If you look at the crisis with Bell Pottinger in South Africa saw itself as pretty much an unbridled advocate for its organization's point of view. I'm not saying that there's no role for advocacy in what we do. That's clearly absurd. But I think we have to look at the model of advocacy that many of us have taken for granted, which is that we are there to hammer home and win on behalf of our organizations at whatever cost, even if that is a cost to the relationships of the organization, and go back to this idea of public relations as being relationship-driven and relationship-building, which suggests that there are therefore limits on the extent to which you should advocate on behalf of your client's point of view. And I wondered if you, first of all, sort of agreed with that broad point, and secondly, felt that organizations were willing to accept that notion. Oscar, you're shaking your head, so go first.
Well, I don't know if it's a limit on advocacy. I just think as we go about doing our advocacy, we should do it in ethical ways, based on factual information, transparency. You know, Richard noted earlier that we do a lot of content publishing ourselves. We have a site called wellsfargo.com/stories. It's our brand publishing website. We publish hundreds of pieces of stories about us, but it's, you know, the news source. It's Wells Fargo. We're not showing up as anything other than ourselves, and we hold ourselves to a standard of accuracy, and everything runs through compliance and legal review internally before we publish it externally. And if we get something wrong, we fix it and get it right. And we try to hold ourselves to the very same standard that we would hope we could expect out of the news media we work with. But it would be a really different exercise if you know, we were cloaked as something else, trying to portray ourselves as something other than Wells Fargo telling its own story. You know, we are who we are, and so we try to be very transparent about that.
But I mean, isn't in some ways, I mean, I think what you're getting at, and it is, I mean, we have seen I mean, we're now having this debate, and you're having, you know, we had this discussion today in our meetings. You've got marketing now wanting to have a significant earned component in a campaign, which leads you to understand that you can't, the owned advocacy, the paid advocacy or owned advocacy model has its defined and understandable limits. And then in the advent of an era where people believe less and understand a basis of fact that they don't agree on, it requires you to have to, and I think this is good for us, we may actually get back to exactly what you just said, having that relationship and having to go and explain this through the lens of a filter or a source that has a trust badge to it that will explain this to others. And that to me, I mean, I think that's probably a good thing in an era in which we know either bad news or worse yet, news that isn't real can whip around the globe at a moment's notice. And, even more so when you have a crisis. I mean, when you had a gunman in a high school, the spike in fake news about what was actually happening is alarming, and it's and deeply saddening. And so, the one slide you didn't have, I think the one to me is the one that, and Fred talked about this in his, that I think is really thought provoking, and something that we all, given Richard's great comments tonight, all should think through, is this notion of not being able to distinguish this paid content versus not, because I've been thinking about this ever since we went through this slide earlier today. If that's the case, I don't understand then what any institution is going to look like in public relations or journalism. Because if you can't tell the difference between something that Oscar writes and something the New York Times writes, then what's the utility of the New York Times?
Okay, I got to get in on this. So I think one of the previous ways that we thought about advocacy and relationships and understanding sense-making, I was in advertising like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and marketing and public relations. And I worked in the multicultural and urban sector. And one of the things that was so important, and many of you know, because you've been around for a minute, know that general market agencies, for example, would get in a lot of trouble because they didn't actually understand all the communities, all the stakeholders, all the lenses through which a campaign might be viewed or related to or rejected, quite frankly, protested. So I don't think we should lose that also as a primary basis of the sense-making work that we need to be doing, which means we need to be engaging with the multicultural owned and rooted agencies and professionals to bring some sense-making to the work. But I think part of the reason why people can't distinguish, or maybe eventually at some point just don't care about the difference between paid and I don't use the words fake news, because I think what we really need the public to understand is disinformation, misinformation, evidence, facts. And we should be the people using those words to make those distinctions. They're taking that relationship and they're mapping it against their own experiences, their community experiences. So where it starts to feel inauthentic and untrue is when people say the economy is doing better than ever, except that people in LA can't afford to live. Or people say the market is really rebounded, and what they see is a total gentrification of their neighborhoods. And being just priced out of the possibility of living in an urban center. That is, to me, the place of reckoning. The reconciliation between people's lived experiences, and you remember the 2030, it's only going to get worse economically if we don't start talking about how we will intervene with public policies, other types of distributions of goods and services in our society. This is where corporations make a huge difference, because whether we like it or not, they actually set the public policy agenda now in the United States. And they also control, for the most part, the distribution of resources in our society. So to me, this is where the reconciliation around fact or myth is rooted in the variability or the instability of people's lives. And that is also a really important dimension of the advocacy and the sense-making. People probably don't care because many people are so resigned. They're so vulnerable. They cannot survive. And I know that we're at USC right now, Everybody's well dressed. We had a really good buffet out there. You know, we're in maybe a different register, but this is not where the majority of Americans are living. And I think it behooves us to be much more in touch. And if people in their own personal networks are not connected to these conversations and realities, then we need to be hiring the agencies, the partners, the organizations to keep us in touch with that reality.
Okay. Paul, can I just say one thing? Because yes, because we had lunch today with a lot of the students. And I asked her this very question. I said, well, one of them had her hat said fake news. So I said, so what do you believe? And do you have a problem sorting through, to your point, what's real, what's not real, what's written by who? And she looked up at me and she said, well, it is confusing. So I guess I just have to myself get smarter and make better decisions. And something about the way she said it, because she's a young person, she's in school, made me realize, all right, so that's what they're going to do, is figure out, read more books like yours, and figure out for themselves what the right thing to do is to decide upon and make their life choices.
Okay. We could probably go on for another 5 slides and 10 questions, but I know Fred wants to lead a Q&A, and you guys probably want to participate a little more than you have to this point. So I'm going to hand over to Fred.
Okay. We're really a little bit over time, but we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience if anybody has one. I could listen to these guys talk all night, but I know that a lot of people need to go to work tomorrow. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Yes, Jim?
Comments always. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. 2 comments have always stuck in my mind that related to ethics. One was a CCO or CEO who fired me because I called to his attention an ethical issue in the company, and he said, "Your job isn't to focus on that. Your job is to support sales and marketing." The second was a top 10 bank CEO who said, you know, in banking, who said the issue in banking is always perceived as moving between poles of greed and stupidity. And the regulators keep us, you know, try to keep us honest and roughly in the middle, which is okay. But he said, really, we should be doing that ourselves. And so we really need to do the right thing, in effect. He said that. So 2 different points of view. I think of that now, and to me, what underlies any discussion about ethics is cultural values. We're in a Judeo-Christian heritage of values, all of us, the Western world generally speaking. The Eastern world doesn't have that heritage. And so when we look at China and places like that, they have a different frame of reference. They don't necessarily play by our rules. So when I think of the slide, Fred, about international views of ethics, my question to all of you, since you all deal with international operations to some degree, I would think, is what do you think, how do you see the world in those terms? I mean, are the rules we play by versus the rules other cultures play by?
Okay. Okay.
You go.
I'll go first. Sort of on my discussions in various markets, I think that 2 things are happening. I think the first is that the world is coalescing around a more universal standard of behavior, and the second is that no matter what local standards may be, I think it today behooves organizations to hold themselves to the highest standard of any market in which they do business, for a very simple reason. There's an interesting history here, right? So forgive me for this. So 20 years ago, I covered a case involving Shell in Nigeria, in which Shell participated in the displacement of local people and eventually the hanging of activists who were protesting Shell's facilities by the Nigerian government. And Shell took a lot of flack for that, to be fair, but they felt that it was quite appropriate for them to either encourage this or stand by and allow it to happen, whatever. 20 years later, I was witness to a situation in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, where Rio Tinto went into Ulaanbaatar, and the government essentially wanted to sweep a whole group of people out of the way so that Rio Tinto could build a mine that was going to end up employing something like 10% of the Mongolian population. And the government was like, if we need to displace 10,000 people to do this, let's just do it. It'll be good for the majority in the long run, greatest good of the greatest number. And Rio Tinto more or less refused to do that, and instead set up a series of sort of community forums, listened to everybody's point of view, facilitate, and behaved in a totally different way than Shell. And the reason wasn't that, well, the reason may have been that Rio Tinto was just run by nicer people than Shell, but I don't think that's it. I think it's that in today's world, those 10,000 people who don't even have electricity have way more power than, in some ways, and you'll disagree perhaps with this, than a Fortune 500 company, because they have a tremendous moral authority. And Rio Tinto knew that if people in America, if people in Australia, if people in the UK found out about this, it would become a huge cause, and Rio Tinto would be excoriated for it at great cost. So you have to today behave, even in the darkest corner of the world, as if you were operating in full sunlight, even in the most repressive country in the world, as if you were operating in a democracy, because otherwise you will destroy your reputation.
Thank you, Paul. That was a very long question and a very long answer.
Sorry.
So we don't have time for very many more. We have one more question from the audience. Yes, back there.
So, Melissa, you talked a little bit about, thank you, how CEOs are sort of waiting to be told when to take that stand, and we talked about pushing change onto clients. And recently there's been a lot of companies that have taken stands on issues that are seemingly unrelated to their actual product, like tiki torches having to come out against racism, or various tech companies coming out for gun control. So at what point do you think the COO or the PR professional steps in that process, when it's something that is completely unrelated to the product that you're actually selling? You're not taking a stance on like environmental impact of a large company. You're taking a stance on something that technically you have no hand in.
Exactly. So Patagonia is okay talking about the park, but are others. So that's an excellent question, because the first thing I would counsel is, yes, stand up, but do it in a believable way, and don't stand up for everything. And don't pick 1,000 points of light. Pick 2 and then stand by them, not for a year, not for 2 years. Think about it long term, and then put everything behind it. And so I think that, there is this rush, to be the CEO activist and speak out on everything, blog about it, tweet about it, whatever it might be. That's not the way to go. The way to go is to sit back and think, what do your employees want from you? How do I serve the employees and what they want to work here in this community? Once you understand that, then you can pick a few things and be believable on those, and also maintain from a sustained way all of the evidence that would support that, so that you're doing rather than blah, blah, talking.
Yeah, I think society wants to see more civil and human rights enacted in all types of different machinations. So I don't think that there's a shortage of problems to solve that CEOs and companies can get involved in. And if the data holds true that businesses are going to be at the forefront of setting some of the additional agenda for the public, then now is the time where, despite kind of the specifics of electoral politics, what everyday people want is the stability of civil rights, of fair wages, of all of these kinds of issues. And I don't think that that's the leadership space for companies, if there were ever a space.
And just to build off Melissa's point, it is being driven by many of the examples that you gave, not necessarily or foremost by customers, but by the people that sit in those offices every day and represent those companies, and who are being asked by their friends and others, and then ultimately asking the leadership, why aren't we involved in this? And wanting to attract the type of people they want to attract moves them to need or want to say something.
I would finish off by saying that, every company has innovation someplace, right? And they should use that innovation, the thing that they're really, really extraordinary at, and pivot it to a societal issue and not try to be all over the map, but say, all right, so I'm really good at solving, say, vaccine distribution now because I came from an RFID chip, whatever company. So that makes sense, right? That person gets, all right, so I'm the person that can solve that problem. And I think you have to be aligned with your innovation as well that sits at the core of your company where you invest and then you pivot and then you say, I can sustain that and I can, a percentage of what I develop every year can be siphoned off that way.
Can I ask one last question, please? Our data shows that the average PR person is going to be facing, and you guys see this all the time, ethical issues every day in every decision they make. And it's going to be much more complicated by all the technology trends that we talked about and all the changes we're seeing in the future. But then on the other side, there's this optimism about public relations and business being more ethical. How, as PR people, can we balance this? What kind of skills do we need, or how do we need to operate in order to actually become more ethical in an environment where it's harder and harder to do that?
I think sometimes, first of all, I know I've got 5 people in here from my team, and they've heard me say this before, but, we can't ever use the word spin. We don't spin things. We either have a good story or we don't. And when we don't have a good story, it either can be fixed and made better, or we just have to deal with what we have to deal with. And I think that's the first thing. I mean, because sometimes we just we have to continue to speak the truth internally to our clients and say, I'm sorry, but this is not going to sell. This is not going to work, or we really have a bona fide situation here. And so I think it really begins there.
I think allocating some time to looking at research, academics, we are partners to many sectors of society. We produce research and evidence that will help people make better decisions. And I think one of the things that's so powerful is you can influence the companies you work with to assign books, common reads, common research, shared ideas that can help generate and stimulate conversations, because there isn't a lot of space. I remember working in corporate America. It's one of the reasons I went back to academia, is because I just wanted time to read a book. There are ways in which we need to keep our professional development. Our sense of integrity is rooted in our exposure to a lot of things. And I think that kind of partnership, either with USC or other universities around the country, is incredibly important. Those relationships with academics, teachers, artists, people who can provide other provocations and ways of thinking is of incredible value, and I don't think we should lose sight of that in the mix.
So, sorry, Melissa, I don't want to interrupt.
You're the man.
Okay, so I think we need to cultivate 4 qualities as professionals. I think these are the 4 qualities that define a great public relations counselor. The first is curiosity. And Al talked about this here 2 years ago. That desire to be constantly out there learning about the world, learning about the issues, learning about how our business operations impact real people. The second is empathy, which we've already talked about. The third is integrity, the ability to distill that down to really authentic behaviors. And the fourth is courage, because make no mistake, once you've been curious, once you've experienced empathy, once you've processed that through integrity, it takes balls to go into, or let's not use such a gender-loaded term, perhaps, but it takes incredible courage to go into the CEO's office and tell him something that he and everybody else in the dominant coalition inside your organization desperately does not want to hear or think about. And that courage, more than anything else, the courage to bring an ethical problem to light when all those around you, and be willing to take the consequences for that. If you are genuinely a counselor, that's the most important characteristic you will ever possess.
Get some her CEOs too.
Yes.
Some women CEOs
yes.
Also in the mix.
Melissa?
Well, I actually thought Paul did a good job there.
You kind of nailed that.
I'm not surprised. I didn't mean to sound surprised, although I think I might have sounded surprised.
I'm surprised that you're not surprised.
Oh, yeah. So I think what I would add, though, then is the practicality of what Paul is saying again, one more time, about going into the higher ups, he, she, whatever they are, and saying, before you have me do communications, do you have your act together inside? And having your act together inside means these things. And oh, you're talking about that kind of product? Is that going to work? And so it's a internal punch list that is so critically important that the communicator almost has to say, I'm not doing that. I will not do that. That makes no sense whatsoever. And you could lose your job. I have before lost clients over that, where they'll say, well, I'm giving you an order. It doesn't matter because at the end of the day, it will not help them. So I think the practicality of your very last statement about courage and being very articulate about, you told me it was going to look like this and you wanted to communicate that. Let's back up and re-engineer.
Robert, the last word.
I also thought Paul did a great job. I don't have anything to add. I would just underscore the beginning of it, and it builds off of what you just said, which is curiosity. And that curiosity requires you to not just take what somebody tells you, to explore the definition of it and understand whether or not you are being spun. And having it encapsulates a lot of what the other qualities that Paul talked about. But I think continually having that, whether it is curiosity to figure out what somebody inside is telling you is true, or the curiosity to go and figure out on the outside what has changed and what needs to change inside the company. There isn't a class for curiosity. I wish there was. Everyone should take it, but I think it's a hugely important thing. We talked about it with the students, and there's a lot to learn, and I hope they take the time that they're here to develop if you will, a culture of that curiosity that stays with them the rest of their lives and certainly their professional lives.
One follow-up for you. We've talked about how you counsel a CEO in business when you think they're making a mistake. How does it work when you're talking to the President of the United States? And maybe not just the one you worked for.
Yeah. Well, you're going to get me in trouble potentially with these answers. In some ways, I don't know. I mean, I only have great experience with the one I had experience with, in the sense of you have to have many of the same things. You have to have a lot of courage. I will tell you. I don't know how many times I went into a meeting and you're standing out in the hall and somebody says, "This is BS," and I'm going to go in there and say it. And then you walk in and they great idea, sir. Couldn't agree more. Think we should. And you walk out and you're like, "Hey, where was the guy we were with in the hall?" Because, and I think in many ways, the last two 8-year presidents have both done poorly in their first presidential reelection debate because I think in some ways they're not used to sitting this close to somebody who's running against them, saying a lot of things that are different than what they've been told in an oval room in a white building. And it goes back into that courage. I mean, I certainly thought it when I walked into that room that I had the great responsibility to be as clear-eyed and honest as I could, because in reality I wasn't there serving the CEO of the country. I was not serving the president. I was there serving the people of the United States, and that's the courage you've got to have to do and say the right thing.
I don't know how we could end on a better note than that. I want to thank our panelists. You guys have been fantastic. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank the staff and our students at the Center for PR for putting on this great event and helping with this great report. Be sure to pick one up on the way out and have a safe trip home. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.